Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This last week, a certain Canadian writing in the Washington Post wrote a fictitious column, we'll call it, about what could happen in Canada if a prime minister refused to leave office after an election. And everything he wrote in there was wrong. But I wanted to at least kind of explain to people how the system kind of does work so that we get a better idea and know how to treat this kind of, we'll call it misinformation, that shows up in sources like this. So one of the first things that we always need to remember is that the prime minister stays the prime minister even if they lose the election because they need to resign first. So this is one of the things that allows an incumbent prime minister to seek coalition deals or other kinds of arrangements with other parties. I mean, we do have more than two parties in this country, so that can make governing arrangements creative at times. And we've seen in the last year or 2 years in provinces where they had elections that were super close and the incumbent still was kind of on the cusp and wasn't able to secure a deal with one of the other parties. So these are all legitimate exercises of how things work in Canada, even if the incumbent prime minister doesn't win doesn't win the most seats. So there's this notion about testing confidence. So that's what happened in BC, in New Brunswick, for example. So the premier at the time decided they were going to test it anyway, try and come up with an arrangement with other parties, test confidence in the chamber, didn't get it. Transition of power happens at that point. Not right after the election. So this is, again, like I was saying, a perfectly legitimate exercise of authority in the Canadian system and not something that's illegitimate at all, even though it is occasionally posited as such by certain political actors who are trying to make hay. One of the things that article in particular tried to make hay over was the fact that we have unwritten constitutional conventions in Canada which govern how responsible government works. And there's this insane notion that somehow that makes them more vulnerable to abuse. And that's simply not the case at all. I mean, the UK doesn't have a written constitution, and their systems have been particularly sound for centuries. And Canada, the way our whole responsible government structure works is not in the written part of our constitution. It's in the preamble, which says that we have a constitution similar in principle to that of the UK. And that is basically all of the responsible government stuff. Parties, prime ministers, that kind of thing. None of that is in the written portion of the constitution. And so when you hear people like Elizabeth May talk about, well, parties aren't in the Constitution, well, they are, because parties are an intrinsic part of responsible government. And the Constitution, the written part, may not spell out what parties are, but they're an intrinsic part of how responsible government works. And that's in the preamble notion of a constitution similar in principle to the UK. And so that's why that particular notion is something of a fallacy. Constitutional conventions are still largely enforceable, possibly not necessarily in courts. There is always some issue around that, but that doesn't make them any less real or enforceable in other ways, particularly political ones. We have had an instance in Canadian history where a prime minister did refuse to turn over power after he lost an election. And we'd have to go back to 1896 for that to happen. It was Sir Charles Tupper. his party, the Conservatives, lost the election. The Liberals got about 55% of the seats at the time, and that was really when there were only two parties in the chamber. So there wasn't really an ability for him to find any kind of working partnership with someone else. And this is where part of how our system works kicked in, is because he did not win the most seats, refused to give up power, and then tried to make a bunch of appointments using his authority as the prime minister. But the governor general at the time put his foot down and said, no, you didn't win the election. And he may not have resigned at that point, but it was clear that there was no way that he could maintain the confidence of the chamber at that point, because he didn't have the seats to do it. So the governor general refused to make the appointments, because if you recall, the prime minister doesn't have the power to do that on his own. All of that goes through the governor general, and in the Constitution it's written as the governor in council, which means the governor general acts on the advice of the prime minister. And this is one of those kind of safeguards capabilities in our system. So the prime minister can't act on his own without having to go through the governor general. And if the governor general sees that there is no confidence, the governor general can refuse. And at that point, in 1896, after the refusal, Tupper did step down, and Laurier took over as prime minister at that point. And, Tupper was it was unconstitutional, so on and so on, but it was pretty clear that he had no ability to maintain confidence, and so the governor general made the call. And this is one of those things that the particular Washington Post piece ignores entirely. The governor general is absent from that piece entirely. And this is one of those kind of mechanisms that is a bit of a stopgap if, for a prime minister refused to leave office, because the prime minister has to recall Parliament within a year within a year, not of the election, but of when Parliament last sat. So there is a timeline in there, but there's also the fiscal timelines in which governments run out of money. And this is when they would need to go to the House for supply, which is the estimates process, which is how government departments and so on get funded. And a prime minister who had, lost an election or was refusing to turn over power couldn't simply just keep the money going in order to keep government going. He would have to pass supply, and couldn't do that without having to meet Parliament. The capacity for special warrants to grant money to keep government going is very limited, and wouldn't be able to past about 60 days of him not meeting, he or she, I guess, would not meet Parliament in order to pass new supply. So there's a very narrow time window for a prime minister who wanted to, or who didn't want to relinquish, to be able to attempt to do anything, but they can't really do anything because, again, everything needs to go through the governor general. Orders in council, regulation, any of that kind of stuff, all needs to go through the governor general to sign off on. And so the exercise of pure prime ministerial power is very limited in that regard. So that, again, keeps the system from concentrating power into too much, or into one individual, and there are safeguards that happen along the way. And there is also the possibility that the governor general could dismiss a prime minister. It would have to basically be very absolute last resort. This is the thing where people think that this is an ability to, if enough people write the governor general, he or she can fire the prime minister. That's not how that works at all. It has to be an extenuating circumstance. This is a constitutional fire extinguisher. So if you had a prime minister who had lost an election, could not demonstrate any path toward maintaining confidence in the chamber, and was trying to unduly exercise any kind of authority, the Governor General at that point could dismiss and invite someone else to form government. But generally, the prime minister will take the hint and resign, or announce the intention to resign and let the transition happen, because resignations tend to happen right before the new government comes in, because we don't want the Governor General or the Queen to go without advice. So anyway, this is kind of the way that we've got these particular buffers or safeguards in our system to keep a prime minister from trying to retain power without having lost an election or without the authority to do so. And just because portions of our Constitution are unwritten, that doesn't make us vulnerable at all. In fact, the whole structure of responsible government actually seems to protect us even more than certain countries that have written constitutions. And that is everything for this week. Join us again for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.